Hello everyone and welcome to the Flipped Collaborate for Assessment 2. This is for the second choice, or one of the two choices I should say, of Assessment 2 for teaching literacy this teaching period. So I have already made an Assessment 2 presentation, Flipped Collab, so if you're interested in listening to that, the link will be also in the announcements and DB and a part of the Padlet. But this one that we are talking about today is the multimodal report. Now I haven't made slides as such, which I would normally do because I just want to talk to the assessment details in particular and then sort of talk about assessment and NAPLAN sort of linked into that as well. So from this though, I will be making the interactive slides and try and make them as I suppose, as helpful as possible and get some brainstorming happening about types of assessment, what assessments you can choose from, some of the benefits and limitations of NAPLAN, and also having a bit of discussion around reporting as well. So just remember that this is just a starting point, just to give you a little bit of information off the bat early on in week 7, but you will need to engage with the DB and engage with your ELAs and come or listen to the interactive Collaborate recording just to make sure that you've got the most up-to-date information, because we do get these flipped out pretty early, and sometimes, especially with new assignments, there might be some little things here and there that pop up that perhaps I didn't think of, so just be mindful of that. I'm going to scroll straight down. Oh, actually, let me just give you a bit of an overview first. I'm sure that you can all see and read yourself that this is Assessment 2, which I always call Assessment 3. It always gets me mixed up when we have Assessment 1A, 1B, and then Assessment 2. It's 2,000 words, give or take 10%. It is worth 40% of your mark, and it is due Monday the 4th of February, which is the Monday of week 12. So we know that we have two options. I'm not going to talk too much about the unit outcomes because I think you can have a read of those yourself, and I'm going to scroll down and get straight to the assessment details. So basically what we need to do in this multimodal report, is that we need to briefly explain NAPLAN and two other forms of assessment and reporting in English. We're going to critically compare and evaluate the benefits of NAPLAN and a couple of other forms of assessment and reporting in English. We're going to be using the Australian curriculum, in particular the years 4, 5 and 6, so upper, to help support what we are saying in this particular report. And then we're going to obviously have this as a something that is using multiple modes, which we'll talk about at the very end of this report. We'll talk also a little bit about some aspects of the rubric too. So that's just a very brief overview on what this report is going to look like. Now, I know that this happened in previous incarnations of this unit where they used the term multimodal report, and as conscientious as some students are, they think to themselves, oh, I have to write a report, so I better source some sort of report framework because I want to make sure that I've written my report correctly, which is a terrific way to look at it. Except with this particular report, I'm going to use the word report quite loosely. So we don't need to have an introduction and conclusion, or it's not an essay structure, and it's not even a typical report structure. I wouldn't worry so much about how the actual piece is formatted and structured. I was just worrying more about these dot points and having a really, really good look at the rubric to make sure that you've covered everything, rather than worrying about how to write a report as such. With a lot of these essays and reports and different assessments, I find that they use the term sort of loosely and they don't expect a proper report format. So as long as you've covered everything that you need to cover, there's no particular style or structure or way of writing the particular assessment. As long as you've covered the things that we are going to mention today and in the assessment details and in the rubric itself. So before we can start explaining what these are in our first dot point, we really need to talk a little bit about assessments itself. So it's asking us to focus on NAPLAN and to also focus on two other forms of assessment. So this is quite a broad, I suppose, scope that you've got to work with here, because all we are restricted to is the fact that it's an English assessment, and the form or the type or the mode of assessment that you choose is really quite open and up to you about what you are interested in and what you would like to find out more about. So whether it's writing or reading, or whether it's formative assessment or something a bit more summative or something diagnostic, it's completely up to you about what form of assessment you want to have a look at. And you might even say to yourself, well, I'd really like to choose one form that's a bit more open and a bit more, I suppose, informative in its approach, or and then something that's maybe a bit more formal, a formal style test, versus say something that's like a reading discussion. So you could have two different types of assessment like that, where they're quite different, and you might expand your knowledge on two quite different things. Or you might want to take, say, two assessments that are really quite similar. Perhaps you've got two formal reading style comprehension tests, and you would like to sort of compare one. You're not going to be comparing one against the other. You're going to be looking at them as separate entities, but it might be interesting when you're looking at the benefits and limitations of each of them, that it just sort of gives you a better idea on how they actually assess comprehension, or perhaps writing, or something that's within the same vein. So you're sort of keeping your thinking and focused on one particular aspect. So the assessment point of it is really quite open. There's lots and lots of different ideas within Chapter 7 of our e-text that starts talking about assessment, and there's also an assessment for writing chapter further along as well, which I think was, I wasn't sure if it was Chapter 12, no, it must be after that. So there's an assessment chapter on writing as well, which we've had a look at for our readings, which are really helpful in giving you ideas. Like within Chapter 7, there's a whole list. There's a table 7.2 where it gives you a whole list of different types of assessments, from informal discussions to reading inventories, read and retell, vocabulary tests, tests per minute, different comprehension tests. I think one thing that we do need to be mindful of, though, is that we are focusing more, I suppose, on upper school. So within those Year 4, Year 5 and Year 6 range. So we probably don't want to give, a basic sight word test to somebody who's in grade 5 or grade 6. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about the appropriateness of the assessment tools that we're choosing. So I suppose you can try and think about it in like sort of practical sense. In maybe you say to yourself, I'm going to imagine myself as a grade 5 teacher. I'm going to be looking for assessments to use and try and put like a bit of a classroom, real life spin on things. You're generally not going to be using running records anymore. You're not going to have sight word tests. You really do need to choose things that are age appropriate. Most of the kids at that age are going to be able to decode fairly well, so we're really needing something that's going to give us some insight into how well they're comprehending and using their knowledge of reading to give you more insight into the text. So think about two forms of assessment. It's completely up to you which ones you would like to choose. You can keep it open, you can keep it the same. The choice is yours, which is excellent, as long as they fit in with that appropriate age group. So at the moment we are just talking about them. And I suppose when I said before that the report didn't need any particular structure, I suppose you could think of point 1 as kind of like a small introduction, because it's where we're just briefly explaining about NAPLAN and what our other two forms of assessment and reporting in English are. We don't want to be too general with our explanation of NAPLAN, so I suppose from here on in, whenever we talk about NAPLAN, we always have to say that we're looking at it from a literacy point of view, and we don't want to talk about it too generally, which I'll talk about in that next little part when we get to dot point 2. But just always remember that we're having an English focus, and if we imagine ourselves as that grade 5 teacher sitting in the classroom, and we need to get information about the kids that are in front of us, and we need that data that's going to inform our teaching, well, we need to be thinking about what information NAPLAN could give us in terms of literacy. So make sure that you've got your literacy hat on always when you're thinking about all the assessments, but NAPLAN in particular, because it does have those numeracy components. Just make sure that you're talking only about literacy. So after we've just briefly explained about what NAPLAN is and what our other two forms of assessment could be, we're going to move on to critically evaluating. Now we'll give you a bit more of a chance to explain about dot point number 1 in the interactive collab. So we'll have a bit more of a discussion about what you could have in your explanation and what would be appropriate. It's just a bit tricky to cover too much here today, so make sure you listen to that. So once we've got our brief explanation over with, we're going to get down, I suppose, into the more nitty-gritty about what the benefits and limitations are in terms of NAPLAN and the 2 assessments that we've chosen. We do need to make sure that we're focusing on benefits and limitations, because if I scroll down and have a closer look into the rubric, we do need to make those detailed comparisons to show that you've got that critical analysis and the interpretation and that deep level thinking that's giving us more detailed response. So make sure you have a look at both those benefits and limitations of NAPLAN and your 2 other forms of assessment in English. Now, I was thinking to myself, there is lots and lots of different websites around talking about NAPLAN. So you can easily Google and come up with a lot of different stuff in terms of what the benefits to NAPLAN are and what the limitations are. And you come up with sites a lot like this. So it's just a general site, and then, oh look, what are the positives and negatives of NAPLAN teaching? And you might be sitting there thinking, brilliant, I've got all my answers, I've got all my benefits and my limitations, positive, negatives, all listed out for us. My advice here is, there could be sites that have some great stuff, but there also could be some things that could be perhaps a little bit too general. So this is looking at NAPLAN in general as a testing or assessing for lots of different reasons, not just thinking about it from a literacy sort of classroom point of view like we are looking at it with this assessment. So just be mindful that some of the points that they make might not be the best to take from this to use in your particular assessment, because when we think about what assessment is used for, we're thinking about it, again, with our literacy hat on, sitting down thinking about the 24 kids in front of us and what are the best tools that we can use to drive our teaching and give us the data we need about the kids in front of us to be able to progress them to whatever their next point is. So that's what we're looking at it from a point of view on. So when I have a look at, say, this website, for example, it talks about things like, there could be pressure placed on the school because they want to get like good my school website things, which is a downside of using a tool like NAPLAN, is the school pressure and the pressure to, to have kids practice and things like that. But those kinds of answers aren't really informing us about what we want to know about literacy and what data is going to help us progress our kids. These are sort of more general negatives. The fact that it's only done once a year, it doesn't cover enough skills, they're saying, potentially. And they're talking about the high amount of pressure on kids and the anxiety it could cause, but all of those sorts of things, the exam pressure, I suppose, is what they're going to look at. But again, that's not telling us about what the quality of the information is. So I want to look at quality of information. What's the quality of the data that we get back from NAPLAN? So just be wary of these generic websites. They're definitely worth having a look over because they can sort of guide you in the right direction, but just make sure that you're really honing in on the quality of the data that comes back. When I think about NAPLAN personally myself, and I think about it from a literacy teaching point of view, some of the benefits could be that there is quite a broad range of skills being tested. So when you have a look through the reading and writing in particular, say data for grade 3 to grade 5, you're seeing questions that involve lots of different comprehension strategies. You're seeing questions that test a student's ability to analyse language features, or they might be looking at if the kids can determine the purpose of a piece of writing, or they might be looking at what the author's intent was or the audience. So I find that it does cover quite a good range of skills in terms of what we're looking for in those sort of middle to upper years of primary school. It's also testing for the value added. So when kids do NAPLAN in grade 3, they sit down and complete the test, and then those who are in grade 5 work through further questions. So you can actually see the progress from grade 3 to grade 5, and then of course with 5 to 7 and 7 to 9. So you can see that every kid should have made progress in that time, and you can see what the value added, so the extra score or extra progress they've made in that time. And I've analysed a lot of NAPLAN data in my time, and we always look for what was the value added to each particular child. It didn't matter what their starting point was. We just wanted to see that there was some progression or value add in that time. So I found that that was really helpful in literacy, that we could see the progress that was made from year to the following 2 years. In terms of limitations, I think the biggest thing for me in terms of being a literacy teacher and being able to use NAPLAN data is that it's just too old by the time you get it. So we think about kids who sit the test in the beginning of May. As a classroom teacher, we never saw results until could potentially be August, but most definitely September. So you've got like a 6-month expanse. The data is out of date. So in terms of being able to inform my literacy teaching, it doesn't really matter about the quality of the questions. If I'm getting data 6 months later, well, I certainly have hoped that my kids in my grade have progressed an outstanding amount in that 6 months. So it's not an up-to-date. I've never used it to inform my teaching in the classroom. It does have other purposes, but you can investigate that a little bit further. We will have a look at NAPLAN in detail in the interactive collab and talk you through some more of the benefits and limitations, and perhaps do a bit of a brainstorm and get everybody thinking about what some of the things you could use in your critical evaluation. And remember, it is a critical evaluation. We really want to use some really strong language. If you have a look at the HD section of this report, it talks about the depth and breadth, and really have your literacy hat on and really think about what are the benefits to using the data, and is it good quality data. Once we've got our other 2 assessments chosen, so perhaps you've chosen probe, perhaps you've chosen read and retell, perhaps you've chosen a writing moderation, a writing conference, whatever it is that you've chosen, you also need to look at the benefits and limitations of those. So you've talked about NAPLAN first and got that one done. Then you would do your second assessment and talk about that one in terms of critically evaluating the benefits and limitations. And then you would also have your third assessment as well. So you have 3 in total. NAPLAN must be 1, and then 2 others. Now, before I continue on to talk about the Australian curriculum, I wanted to also mention that you probably noticed that it doesn't just say assessment, it also says reporting as well. I had to seek some clarification about this because I wasn't quite sure how they wanted us to talk about reporting in this setting. So we're all pretty much familiar with assessment at this point of time. We know that assessment is used to drive our teaching. And I suppose when we think about reporting, we're thinking about it in terms of the things that I talked about in the presentation video. So things like student-led conferences or parent-teacher interviews or your formal report that you receive from the school. But I was researching around a little bit more, and I thought, well, reporting can be reporting in a lot of different ways. And when you have a look at the ACARA website, it breaks it down to this particular quote, which I'm going to read to you. So it talks about the fact that reporting is the process used to communicate knowledge gains from assessing student learning. The purpose of reporting is to give information on the progress of students to parents, but also support staff, teachers, principal, class, leadership, external stakeholders, etc., etc. So there could be lots of forms of reporting about student progress within the school. It's not always just to parents. So I think what's important to remember is how we can talk about how some of these assessments might be reported on to others within the school. So when we are critically evaluating NAPLAN, it would be a good idea to make some comment or tell us your opinion on how you think NAPLAN is reported on. So you could make links to parent comments that parent information that's received. But also you need to make connections to the fact that NAPLAN is essentially, in terms of government and external stakeholders, is generally what NAPLAN's for. So as I mentioned, the data is 6 months old. We don't use it to inform our teaching, but it is used widely within the school to set up things like strategic plans and annual implementation plans, which are set up for goals for the school for the next couple of years. It's used a lot for government findings. It's used a lot for funding in different ways, or which areas need support. So you could talk about the fact when you're doing your critical evaluation about how the data from NAPLAN is received in terms of a reporting, not only just to parents, but to lots of different places. With your other two assessments, you can also talk about reporting. I don't think reporting to parents is the easiest one to go on. I'm tending to look at it more from, I suppose, a collegiate point of view. So if you sat down and did a reading conference with a particular child and found out some interesting information about that child, you might take the data back with you to your team or your PLT team or your collegiate group or whoever it is that you're working with, and you could talk about the data and talk about the student progress with your team, and your team would give you some insight and some help into what to do next, and perhaps set some learning goals or reflect on the learning goals. So it doesn't just need to be reporting to parents. You can talk about how your assessment fits in terms of reporting. So if you've got a formal assessment, you might talk about it in a collegiate team. If you've got like a self-assessment, well, you're reporting on student progress to the student themselves. If you're doing an informal discussion, if you're doing a reading conference or a writing conference, you're actually reporting to the student themselves on how they are progressing. So that was actually part of the ACARA explanation, where they talked about reporting can be any information that is passed on to the student, parent, support staff and teachers. So the student receiving information themselves is a form of reporting. You're reporting to the student. So try and think about which reporting aspect links in well with the assessment that you've chosen. So can it be reported to students? Can it be reported to parents? Can it be reported to other teachers? It's just a way we need to sort of broaden our idea, I suppose, on what reporting is, and it's not just to parents. It could be to a learning specialist within our team or something like that as well. So you want to make some connections to and critically evaluate how those things are being reported on as well. We also want to identify 3 content descriptors within the upper primary years. We've got 4 and 5 and 6, so make sure that you stay to the upper primary years in the Australian curriculum. And we're going to use these to support our critical evaluation. So we want 1 content descriptor for each form of assessment in literacy. So we are going to give you some support and some scaffolding around this within our slides for the interactive collab. So our ELAs will be presenting about some particular assessments perhaps that they've used, and they'll make a connection to where it lies within the Australian curriculum. It's not too hard to find. For example, if I was looking at the benefits and limitations of doing, say, a probe test, I could just have a look straight into our ACARA scope and sequence. I find the scope and sequence easy to use because it's just, you can see the clear progression through the years right up to grade 6. So we can scroll down, and I know it's right at the bottom because I have to look for it every single time. We can look at, where's our comprehension strategies? They're still coming. So here we go, comprehension strategies in the strand of literacy, and it's entitled comprehension strategies. So if I was looking at something like probe, I know that it's linking directly into the outcomes in 4, 5 and 6, because probe is testing the kids' ability to use these comprehension strategies. You can test literal and inferred meaning in a probe test. And you also can test for how well they can analyse and evaluate. There's also a question on vocab as well. So if I could make there is a Cara link to vocab as well. If I scroll back up, I apologize for the long scrolling. There's quite a bit to cover. Here we go. So we've got vocabulary. So we're going to incorporate new vocabulary and understand how different words are used in different contexts. So that's another thing that probe is testing against. If you were doing, say, something with writing, you could have a look at text cohesion and perhaps punctuation, and also perhaps concepts about print. There's also things to do with sentence structure, which could be tested in a writing sample as well. So lots of different ways that you can connect your assessment to the curriculum. Because at the end of the day, we want an assessment that is going to inform our teaching, and this is the stuff that needs to be taught. So we need to know where kids are up to in terms of these different content descriptors. So we only need to have one connection in our critical evaluation of each of these forms of assessment. So once you've got all the content done, this sort of connects back to, I suppose, the more of the fun part of the assessment, which means that it needs to be multimodal. So what that means, and we've got the Seeley Flint Kitson quote in here, is that the report must be presented in a multimodal format. In this context, multimodal means a text that combines two or more of the ways in which meaning can be created and communicated. So it could be linguistic, visual, auditory, and spatial modes. We need a minimum of 2 different modes of communication must be incorporated. So you could have a text with images, or you could have an audio component, and we want appropriate modes of communication. Now I'm going to have a quick look at our rubric. So as you can see in the pass section here, we're looking for at least 2 modes have been used, and that's just for a pass. But if we want to have a look at the higher levels, you can see here that in the credits area it says at least 3. So just remember that when it says in the assessment details, I just don't want anyone to be confused about this. So at the pass level, it says 2 modes, so at least 2 for a pass, at least 3 for the credit, and you can see that within the D and the HD we're looking for multiple modes. So you're really going to have to think about, does it have an auditory component? Maybe I can talk to my assessment, maybe I can have visual images popping up. You can include some videos, but just be mindful if you make connections to YouTube videos that your ELA doesn't have time to watch a 20-minute video about assessment. So make sure that you can have a link to it, or use elements of it, but just be mindful that they won't be able to watch the whole lot as part of their marking, because they're pretty restricted for time already. And just be mindful of the way you're communicating your ideas. So we want the images to be relevant. We want the the way you're communicating is really thorough, and I suppose the things have meaning to them. So if you're going to use a video, if you're going to use a text, or you're going to use some sort of connection to something, some image, that we just want it to be relevant to whatever you're talking to at the time. So if you're talking about something to do with NAPLAN and you're making a point about how the data is too old by the time it gets to you, you might have a link to something that's relevant to that. So you could have pictures, we could have lots of different ways of presenting, whether it's PowerPoint, whether you make some sort of screencast like this one, whether you make a YouTube video. There's lots of different things that you could choose from in terms of presenting. It may be a Word document that has different elements of visual images, but then links to perhaps an audio component or something, or maybe a PowerPoint presentation that you talk to. I was saying in my presentation video that this screencast program is really good, and it's free, and you get 15 minutes free chatting without having to get any some sort of subscription or something. So you could have your PowerPoint going and you could talk over it. I suppose through this screencast program as well, it's really easy to make a YouTube clip, and pretty much does it all for you. And I find when I use screencast, it's actually quicker than just uploading my own video itself. So it does need to be multimodal, and we'll talk more about what multimodal can mean and give you some ideas and perhaps share ideas with other students in the interactive collab. The interactive collabs are on next week, so please come. We want to do lots of brainstorming and help you get lots of ideas for this particular assessment. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in interactive collab next week.